Welcome back to Tack and Track. Today we're going to be talking about the M1 Carbine. For those of you who are new to the channel, welcome. We're covering a series of World War II rifles, handguns, and a shotgun ahead of a shoot where we're going to put these up in a bracket style competition, shoot them up against one another. We also do quite a few firearms reviews, so welcome to the channel. For all of our returning viewers, this is going to be the last rifle in our series. After this, we'll cover the handguns and the shotgun, and then we'll be ready for the bracket style competition shoot we've got coming up. So before we can understand the M1 Carbine, we really need to talk about why it was needed, what it is, what it's not. Then after that, we'll take a look at the design. Then we'll go back and take a look at the design process and designers. And then right there at the end, we'll take a look at this rifle as an individual because this is the particular M1 Carbine that we will be shooting in the competition. And we'll take a look at it as an individual just like we've done with all the other guns that we're going to be shooting in this competition. So why was the M1 Carbine needed? Well, in order to kind of tell that story, we need to go all the way back to World War I. At the end of the war, the U.S. Ordnance Department started looking at how effective were they. What weapons did well that they offered? What weapons did well that other people offered? What worked? What didn't work? So they could avoid the carnage of that war again. And what they noticed when they were looking at German injury reports and field hospital information is that despite the number of 1911s that were issued, nobody really ever got hit by these. There's some few case instances where they were used to pretty good effect. These are really, really good handguns. Now what we see today with a modern gun like this one and a World War I, World War II configuration is a little bit different, but nevertheless, they were good handguns. But what they found is the people who were issued these, drivers, radio operators, stuff like that, couldn't use them. A pistol like this takes a lot of training. And really, the guys who were issued just a pistol, that wasn't their job. Their job wasn't to shoot at the enemy. Their job was to do whatever else they were supposed to be doing. And they weren't able to use them efficiently. And realistically, the range for a untrained shooter with a 1911 is relatively short to be able to use efficiently. So the U.S. Ordnance Department post-war took a look at that and they go, this is a problem. We really need to fix this. And in typical interwar fashion, what'd they do? Absolutely nothing. So this brings us to just ahead of the U.S. entering World War II. They're sitting there watching the German blitzkrieg come across Europe. And what they realized is that the Germans were able to punch through the French, the Polish, whoever they were facing's lines and end up in the rear areas where they would be facing troops who weren't armed for regular style combat really quickly. And they realized that if they're going to go back and reissue 1911s to guys like truck drivers, well, they can't use these effectively, and they've got no defense against this blitzkrieg punching through the lines. So they wanted a light rifle. And that's what kind of brings us to the M1 Carbine. What they wanted was a rifle that was effective up to 300 yards, and they wanted a rifle that was small, light, and compact. The design specifications were actually under 5 pounds. Now this little guy comes in at 5.2 pounds. So a little bit over target weight. But what they wanted is a rifle that they could issue in mass, wasn't horribly expensive, didn't require a lot of training to be able to use effectively and efficiently, and would provide a decent range. 300 yards was the specification, and wouldn't get in everybody's way. So they wanted something that would make these rear echelon troops or radio operators or mortar teams or artillery units effective and capable to defend themselves, but they also wanted something that was light, not going to be in the way, and that didn't require a lot of training, because These are all guys who have a more important job to do than to spend a whole bunch of range time trying to learn how to use 1911. So that's what brings us to this design. So now that we're here, let's talk about what this is and what this is not. Because the US has to find out what this is not quite a good deal. So what this is this is a good substitute for a pistol. It makes a soldier more efficient and effective than a pistol. What this is not a submachine gun. Now, the later M2 variant is select fire and can substitute for a submachine gun when necessary. It may not be the best substitute, but it will work in that role. But we don't see the select fire versions of these till post World War II. What it's also not, it's not a substitute for the M1 Garand rifle. The Garand or Garand is a full combat rifle. This is something that's effective at range, delivers a lot of power on target, can be quite precise. This is not a good substitute for that. Troops really liked the M1 Carbine because they've got to walk around and carry this guy. Well, it's lighter weight, makes it popular among the troops just because it's not as heavy to carry. The M1 Carbine really gives birth to an entirely new set of weapons. These are Pdws, personal defense weapons. These are weapons that we're familiar with today. The MP7, the MP5, the PS90, these are all really good examples of Pdws, which really spawn off of this gun. And while other countries have tried it before, we've seen other carbines in here. We've seen other style of weapons in this class. The Luger had a available stock and was available in a fully automatic version to kind of fill that PDW role. But really, the U.S. introduction of this, they produced 6 million of these between 1941 and 1945. And the doctrine that went with this rifle to the U.S. Armed Forces during World War II really gives birth to the PDW line of firearms. Because what we see is then combined the correct doctrine with the weapon that fills the class. What we've seen from other countries when they're looking to do this is we see stuff like the Type 38 Arasaka that we've got over here. And what that rifle is basically a cut down version of their mainline infantry rifle. Now, a lot of people look at the M1 Carbine and the M1 Garand and they go, okay, they made it smaller. These are two totally separate weapons. They really don't have a whole lot in common with each other besides the way that they look. The outside op rod, the way that the bolt actually looks and fits into the rifle, and the stock setup are very similar between the two, but that's really where the similarities end. If we look at all the other powers of the time, they're basically using the same round and just cutting the rifle spec. This has a completely different operation system than the M1 Carbine. It shoots a different round. Now, they did decide on a 30 caliber round to make cleaning materials, other stuff that they have work between this and the other rifles of the time period. So having the same bore diameter was important, but they didn't want the full power cartridge of 30-06 for this. And what they ended up settling on was 30 caliber carbine, which when we take a look at this, it's a straight walled case. It does have a 30 caliber round in it. This looks very similar to a pistol cartridge. And once again, when we're looking at these, they're looking for something that's easy to train troops on that aren't frontline infantry soldiers. So the reduction in powder here was important, especially as we decrease weight to reduce recoil for these guys who, of course, they went through basic training and they know how to shoot a firearm, but that's not their job, and they may not be the most proficient at that. So this reduced powder cartridge was perfect, because all they were really trying to get out of this was a maximum of 300 yards. And realistically, everybody knew that if these were going to be thrown into combat, they were probably going to be 100 yards or less in their real world use, because this is not something that was intended to engage the enemy. It's something to be used to defend yourself as you retreat, right? This isn't something that you really send guys into combat with, that you intend to fight the enemy. Now, you do see some frontline use of these. Very commonly in the Pacific, you see frontline use of these. Their weight is really where these become a good frontline infantry weapon, and they're often given to officers. So if you're an officer and your main job is to command your troops, or you're a radio operator at the front and you're trying to carry this big heavy radio around, and you engaging the enemy, even though you're on the front line, is a secondary function, this was a good weapon for that. So we do see some frontline use of this. And we do see some negative reports coming out of the war on these. And especially when we get to Korea, we see a lot of negatives on this rifle. But most of the negatives were from soldiers who were trying to use it in a role that it shouldn't be used. During Korea, the U.S. starts trying to replace the M1 Garands with these, and it's not a fair replacement. So let's take a look at the design of this particular rifle. We'll go ahead and take it out of the stock here so we can look at that. And then after that, we'll talk about the design process, and then we'll look at this rifle as an individual. All right, so let's take a look at how this little guy works, because it works a little bit differently than some of the other guns that we've talked about. It is semi-automatic, so I'm going to pull it out here. And this op rod right here on the side of the firearm looks very similar to the M1 Garand rifles. So the immediate assumption is that this is a scaled down Garand. It's not. So up here in the front, we've got a little gas tappet system. So what happens here is we've got gas going down here, gets vented off, and there's a little tappet that just kind of hits the machined portion of the op rod down here on the bottom, forces it backwards, rotating the bolt, pushing it back, expelling the spent casing, grabs another one out of the magazine here, loads it back into the chamber, and you're ready to go again. Back here on the back, we've got a pretty simple, straightforward trigger that's built into it. We do have a safety right here built into the trigger guard. Now, the magazine feed system works much more closely to other firearms that we're familiar with today. So let's take a look at how that works. If we take a magazine, insert it in right here, we can press this button right here on the side, and it will allow us to remove that magazine from the firearm. Also, we've got a detent on the top of the op rod handle here, so when we push it back, we can actually press this detent in, and it will hold the action open for us. Other than that, we've got pretty straightforward sight setup. Once again, it is shielded up here in the front. Simple post up front. In the back, we do have adjustable sights, like what we saw on the 1903 A3, but the sights are only for 100 yards, 250 yards, and 300 yards. This straight-walled case cartridge does have a fair amount of drop, so we can see at the 300 yard setting, that's pretty high up the ladder here, and you're getting a fair amount of drop there. This is not really intended to engage enemies at pretty good range. Realistically, this was most likely used under 100 yards. Now, we see some longer range engagements, but that's really kind of where you want to be with this guy. So let's put it back in the stock, and we'll talk a little bit about design history here. All right, so we've already talked a little bit about why the U.S. needed this gun. So let's talk a little bit about how they went forward with the process. So, U.S. Army is looking for something that fills this role. They have a trial set forward. Now, the first trial required that the gun be select fire, which is something that we obviously don't see on this gun. And Winchester, who designed this gun, didn't participate in the first set of trials. Now, Winchester did design the cartridge for these guys, but they didn't design a rifle. They've got a whole lot going on. They've accepted a contract to make the M1 Garand rifles, so they've already got a lot on their plate. They're really not interested in designing this guy, but they are working on a design replacement for the M1 Garand. A gentleman who goes by the name of Carbine Williams was working on one of John Moses Browning's brothers' designs to try and finish it for what they called the M2, which will be a later name for this guy, but not the same rifle as this. He's working on a design called the M2. First trials come and go. They don't accept any of the rifles, and he's working on a replacement for the Garand. And what they decide to do, Winchester is kind of advised that, hey, look, nobody's going to accept anything but the M1 Garand for quite a while. You guys need to quit that. What about this other rifle that we're looking at? And what they did is took that scaled up design from 30-06 that they were working on and took it down to a smaller scale. And this is what they came up with. When they realized that there was no future in trying to beat out the Garand for war production, they go, okay, well, where can we find a home for this design? The home that they found was in the M1 Carbine. Now, we've already talked about the fact that this is not a select fire gun. The M2s are. There was some use of the M2s during World War II, right there at the very tail end. But the story of the select fire M2 is really a Korean War story. But these guns were designed up front with the capability of knowing, hey, look, we might really want that gun and select fire. So the ability to make this gun easily select fire was important for the rifle. Now, as we're going to be shooting this in the competition, we are going to be shooting it quite a lot with the 30-round magazines from the M2, and these magazines are slightly different than the M1 Carbine magazines, but we're only going to load them with 15, because throughout the duration of the war until the M2 came out, all the M1 Carbines were issued with these smaller 15-round magazines. It wasn't until the Select Fire M2 came out that we see the capacity upgraded to 30. Guys, I really hope you enjoy learning about some of these World War II firearms. I really hope you enjoy our shoot. Keep in mind, this involves a lot of effort and a lot of money to put this together and to make this work. So if you guys enjoy this, please, guys, hit that sub button for us. Help us out on our journey here, and hopefully we can keep bringing you more content like this. Thanks as always for checking us out today on Tack and Track. So as we're looking at this particular rifle, this is the rifle we'll be shooting for our competition. We'll notice a few things. It's in exceptionally good condition, but it does have replacement sights. These weren't the standard sights on this particular model. This was a Arsenal refinish, so we do have a little bit more modern sights. This is an inland manufactured M1 Carbine. This one was dated in 1944. Really good shape overall. We do have some minor damage to the stock right here that you can see, but other than that, this particular firearm's in great shape.